Well, I've been joined today by Neil. Neil is the founder of Data Futurist, who does some great work in social housing around data quality. And they're also now the delivery partner for data standards, working with Hacked. Um, and as we know, data standards have gained a lot of momentum. I've got a lot of support, and really, they're needed in the social housing sector. A sector, obviously, I've worked with a number of years. I also work in the data space as well. But what we consistently keep finding is that data quality is poor. There's a number of downgrades that are happening because of data. Systems aren't integrated enough as well. So with all this in mind, the data standards are perfect in terms of timing. So Neil, I'm going to just hand over to you. Just tell me a bit about yourself, Neil, and what you do with Data Futurists.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name's Neil Topping. Founded Data Futurists just over 10 years ago. Very much with a mission to fix data in social housing. So essentially 10 years later, we're still going with the same mission. But what we've kind of found is there's lots of things around poor data quality, poor management practices around information governance isn't as kind of established. And what we kind of been thinking about is how do we start to address that? Because my last role as an employee was essentially 3 years trying to improve one provider, and we managed to get them a couple of rungs up the maturity ladder with an absolutely huge amount of energy and work to kind of achieve that. But there's too many providers in the sector to do that kind of one by one. So actually, it's about having a community. It's about building up kind of common practices, common knowledge, and that's really kind of where we started looking at the data standards in earnest that have been developed by Hacked with Oscar. There's some really excellent stuff in there, and there's a lot of, I think, work around trying to get people to understand what's in them, what the value is, and how to adopt them, because that's it's quite common for people to be quite puzzled by kind of how do we start on this journey. So that's some of the bits that we're trying to look at now. But what's really good is there's quite a lot of traction, as you mentioned. We've had Housing Technology. I've done a kind of a nice survey in early this year, and then followed it up with kind of a keynote at the Housing Tech conference. You've got MHCLG essentially backing like this initiative around data standards. There is a lot of momentum kind of happening in the sector around standards, which is really positive, because this will actually be the change I think that's required for us to achieve the mission of fixing the data. Because if people standardized, that's really kind of, we're getting to that kind of that point. It's not still probably halfway through the journey, but that is the kind of the end goal, really, is to try and achieve that.
Fantastic. Totally on board with what you're doing. And as you say, so is the sector. Just in terms of, if someone asks this question, and they do, how will this help housing associations and local authorities for day-to-day activities and improving services? So that's a key question for me.
Look, I think it's a really important one, because it's the kind of what's in it for us type question. And it's really kind of, when you start looking at it a bit more kind of globally in terms of how it works, you can go down to the fine-tooth comb of what's happening in an individual system or process, or you can look more globally in terms of how things join up with suppliers, especially. So if you're commissioning like a repairs contractor, you'll have your own scheduled rate code, you'll have your own variation, your property information will be different, you might have different ways of storing addresses. So what you're doing is you've got variability inside your organization, possibly different variability in different systems as well. And then you're pushing variability into your supply chain from your requirements, which will ultimately increase cost, reduce outcomes, because the more complexity you have, the harder it is to get stuff done. Housing's already quite complicated without having the additional complexity and variation in place. So if you were basically ordering a new kitchen and bathroom, you might have a different catalogue from different suppliers, but you might set your requirements before even looking at the catalogue and force them to work in your way. And if you do that from 1,000 different types of variation, you're putting a huge amount of cost and overhead onto the organizations which are ultimately bidding for your work, which will drive up the cost. So actually, if you start standardizing, you can reduce those costs. And that's just using a repairs example. Similar with antisocial behaviour or complaint management or even property management or care and support. They're all kind of featured in the standards. So you can kind of start considering what's in it for me from that perspective. And it's not potentially a quick win, because anything to do with data, if you really know data well, it's not a kind of a couple of weeks work. It's a long-term sustained journey. But if you have that as your end goal, you should be inoperable, which means that you can, like a jigsaw, connect up to all these other organizations in the supply chain, make it really clear cut. This is what we're after. And hopefully some of the tech vendors will align to it as well, to make the barriers to entry to the standards even lower over time. So it just becomes easier and the norm to adopt the standards.
Sure.
So the outliers are the ones that haven't got the standards. So that should ultimately reduce the variation, reduce the cost and complexity for how people have to work.
No, that's absolutely brilliant. That sounds good to me. And are you thinking that the standard is not just for housing? We want to push this to contractors, suppliers, anyone that's also working with any type of housing organisation. We want them to be using these standards to push procurement potentially, IT systems integration, that type of infrastructure.
Absolutely, it's looking at, this is what's talking from the global perspective. So with procurement, you should be asking for the standards to be built into applications for things like stock condition surveys or environmental assessments, those sorts of things. They're reflected to some extent in the standards. So you should be asking make sure it's compatible with the UK housing data standards. And that you've got a good base of requirements from your data side there already covered. And actually, the more people that do that, the more the market will essentially adjust and adapt. That these are requirements, the priority of aligning to these goes up, and it ultimately makes individual housing providers' lives easier, because they don't need to educate as much, because actually there's quite a lot of education coming from MHCLG and their delivery partners around what the standards are, how they're working. Some of the working groups that have been established, it's really just kind of joining the journey and being part of that group to kind of really help standardize information.
Fantastic. And I'd like to get into the details of this as well, because this is excellent in terms of how detailed and granular are you going to go, Neil, with these standards as well. So the things that I would like to personally see is that, from a data perspective, I'd like to see primary keys being used by similar providers. An obvious example is property reference. I think all do have that, but sometimes they don't have it in all systems. I'd like to have foreign keys also in data as well, which matches to the people. So you've got property matching to people as well when possible. Is that the level that you're going to be going into, Neil?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I think is important to say is the data standards, there are already 10 modules in place that have been developed since 2018 to 2022, and they cover a lot of use cases. So the national UPRN is the kind of essentially the gold standard for property references. So you shouldn't really have your internal reference, you should be using the national one, kind of where possible. And ultimately that will act as the primary key, potentially foreign key in many aspects. So that's one of the things that we're doing with some of the uplifting work that we're looking at, is building out the entity relationships, establishing what the key patterns should be. So rather than saying very specifically your system is configured in the wrong way or something like that, it's more, this is I'm trying to avoid being too data geeky, because I'm not quite sure on the exact audience, but what you basically have is, this is how the pattern should look for certain areas. And the three current priorities are damp and mold, obviously with AWAB law coming out soon. We're trying to get some traction in that space. So there's going to be some comms coming out about that. The property hierarchy, which is absolutely critical, but always presents lots of challenges, and personal alert codes. So the real kind of thinking here is trying to make it as easy as possible for people to access, depending on which way they're coming in. If they're like an ops manager, they want to just see, okay, what are the definitions? If they're a technical architect or a database architect, they want to see schemas, they want to see ERDs. So it's really just making it as easy as possible for people to get into it. And the more you try and cover with these things, the less granular you can go in some instances, because actually some of it will not be compatible. But the key thing is to make it essentially ubiquitous, in terms of anybody could take the standards on. Maybe a supplier's systems aren't designed in a way that's compatible, but this is a longer term play. Hopefully the suppliers will adapt and allow the kind of standards to come into play, or ultimately if they don't, and that is the direction of travel, maybe it's time to look at a different supplier over time with your procurement practices saying, is a priority for us, the priority is rising. If you don't adapt, we can't keep working with you in 3 or 5 years, or that type of longer term thinking, really.
That's fantastic, and I would like to actually see that. I'd like to see that here is a entity map. This is how some of your data should look like. This is how it should link with other tables in databases. I think that would be really useful, Neil, because as you can see, we number of organizations with facts and DIMs. Again, I'm going into data terminology here as well, but they vary so differently between organizations. So will you actually produce a bit of an entity map of what we'd like to see within an organization?
So the plan will be for those three areas, which is damp and mold, property hierarchy, and personal alert codes, to have those entity diagram produced with the table relationships. The longer term plan is to have a complete kind of ERD covering the entirety of the standards.
Yeah.
So that's something that we will be working towards, but some of the priorities, because there's legislation coming out, are kind of pushing us towards those use cases at this stage.
Yeah.
But we need to essentially create that fully ERD, and then there's a kind of a universal model for housing data, which people should be adopting, and it really will make it a lot easier for tech suppliers to kind of look at their almost like their Venn diagram cutting of that kind of global map. And some of the modern technologies around ERDs or data modeling tools allow you to export a database off the back of it. So you could ultimately, if you're technically minded, create a background database, SQL database, put some dummy data into it, and then actually have a sandbox and look at how your data aligns from that side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that sounds excellent to me, especially for what I'm trying to do at the minute with our CRM. Almost a lift and shift for IT providers to say that here is an entity diagram. This is what we'd expect. These are attributes that we'd like to see below those as well. I think that would be really useful for the sector as well, and certainly that would help with standardization. Moving on to process, because what I tend to see in housing a lot is that yes, that sometimes there's a great system, but the processes behind it don't really support what the system should be doing. So you can't always blame the IT in a sense as well. How will the standards start looking at maybe some process standards in there as well? The one that I'm referring to, I always seem to refer to, is that repairs in particular, which obviously is very topical, obviously without RBOB's law as well, is that what I'd like to see is one works order. Yeah, and within that works order, it never closes until all the actions below it, all the tickets below it, are all complete. So the tenant doesn't see it's open on this date, now it's closed. So the example I always give is that you have one job and it has a number of trades that you need, where you might need electrician, you might need a plumbing job with it as well. For those almost to be forced through to say that you won't close that job until all the tickets below it are complete. Will you be looking at those type of process improvements as well?
So we'll be looking at process, possibly not from that lens. It's really kind of how the process flows, what information you should capture from the different data points around the standards. Probably with things like decision trees of, if this happens, do this, if this happens, do this, from that kind of perspective, rather than necessarily prescribing how you have to manage your service. It's really, this is how like damp and mold should work at a higher level, and this is the information you need to gather or should be available to gather at different stages. So that's really more prescriptive it is, either the less adoption there will be, which is a kind of a fundamental challenge, or the greater chance is that there'll be use cases we haven't managed to consider that aren't compatible. So it's really about getting the right balance. You don't want to go to so high level that it doesn't make any sense at all. You don't want to go too granular to kind of alienate people to not adopt, or it fundamentally doesn't suit the systems how they've been designed, because you've got to think about backward compatibility. People will have technical solutions already in play, and what you're basically saying is you won't be able to follow the standards until you've backed out of that solution, which wouldn't necessarily be the right call. So it's about getting that mid-level point. If that makes sense.
No, that absolutely does. Obviously, you can't be too prescriptive
Mm.
because people are already set up with the system. So I do get that. Another question that I wanted is in terms of standardization. What I would like to see is that, and the question that I always get is that housing providers say we're very different. But when it comes to systems and IT, you're not. You've all got houses. You have to manage those houses. You've got to manage repairs, compliance, communications with customers. So pretty much you're doing the same thing. What I would like to see is some standardization, especially around schedule of rates. I know there's a National Housing Federation schedule of rates as well. I'd like to see a very standardized SOR in particular as well. Is that something that you'll also be looking at in the standards?
So SORs are currently in there to some extent, but I think a key point around the standards is, again, going back to interoperability. If somebody's already done something really well, there's no point reinventing the wheel.
No.
It's about being able to link up to those different points. So schedule of rates is a really good example. There's a few kind of ways of approaching schedule of rates. Some other ones would be around vulnerability in the home. So there's a Savvy initiative which starts to spec out the information to kind of have cross-departmental sharing in government for vulnerability. So it's really about trying to be the right jigsaw piece to fit into the wider jigsaw, which is all this information, because ultimately the people that are in homes are a tenant from a housing provider's perspective. They're a client of the Department of Work and Pensions. They will be a patient in the NHS. There'll be lots of things. They'll have lots of different parts to play in society, and different organisations will need their information for different purposes. And it's really about making sure the bit that we do for housing really joins up. So I know health and housing is really big, especially with damp and mould. We don't want to do something which essentially locks us away from that. And some of the schedule rate codes, in terms of what you're going to do to the property, might mean the property gets updated, and then that might lead to a possibility of sharing with possibly a GP, possibly somewhere else, to say, actually, we fixed this thing in the home. Damp and mold should be improved, and they might see improvements in the outcomes for respiratory illness that they're treating. So it's around thinking, what can you do with information? How can you join it up? And thinking through some of those use cases, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And looking forward, what I can envisage, and I don't know if you share this vision, is that obviously if you can get some of the standardization in there, almost a national database for social housing, that database, again, to be shared with health, to be shared with other departments, to really get organizations to start working together as well. Is that the sort of image, sort of vision you have for this as well going forward?
So interestingly enough, the Open Data Exchange is something that I'm on as well.
Yes.
With a couple of very, very impressive colleagues, Steve and Kate.
Yes.
That very much looking at building a national database for social housing. So when I talked at the beginning of having a mission to fix social housing, data standards is one of the big building blocks for that, and the national database really is the other part.
Yes.
So if I get those two kind of fixed, or when I say the royal I, if we manage to achieve that, then actually that will just really kind of massively fast track housing into kind of modern digital working practices, rather than kind of everything being quite siloed, everyone being quite individual and very varied in terms of how they work, how the systems work. Because those sorts of initiatives will pretty much, you have to adopt standards to be on a national database.
Absolutely.
That is a kind of prerequisite requirement. Otherwise, you're going to be unable to find a property. I mean, if you went to Rightmove or Zoopla or somewhere like that, you put a property address in, it's just easy.
Yeah.
You should have something similar for social housing, really.
Absolutely.
And it shouldn't be that big a barrier to entry to achieve it. And that's one of the things that we're working towards with the ODX hat on. So Data Future is proudly supporting that, proudly supporting data standards. So exactly as I said, our mission is to fix data in social housing. So we are kind of really putting our weight and support behind the initiatives that I really think will kind of help to achieve that.
Fantastic, and it's a great initiative, and I'm glad we've given a plug to the ODX because obviously it naturally fits this project as well. Something that in the social housing data network we'd like to hear a lot more of. Maybe do some follow-up sessions as well. So I think everyone will be interested in what's happening with it as well. So I think potentially the next thing we'll do is more of an event
Cool.
to take us through it. But really in support of this, and I think the sector, hopefully the sector will also pick this up as well and run with this. Certainly we will be adopting it in the system that we're developing for sure. So thank you very much, Neil. It's been great to speak to you, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.